Hey, everybody, it's another Tuesday, which means it's another MTOM Show podcast. I'm Paul Yeager. Today, we're joined by Kyle Bumsted of Erickson, Nebraska. And we're not even going to introduce you, Kyle. We're going to let you introduce yourself. Give me the elevator pitch. Who's Kyle?
Well, Kyle is a farmer, rancher, row crop out here in central Nebraska with my family here. So we everything from cow-calf to backgrounding into feeding them out, and then we also row crop on the side, corn, soybeans, and quite a bit of hay out here. A lot of pasture rangeland.
I didn't hear you mention anything about a pencil. I thought you were supposed to have a sharp pencil as all of those things.
Oh, well, you do, but I like the mechanical ones, so you know.
So when you say you mentioned a whole lot of things, what's of those? What's your favorite to do?
I'd say probably the row crop, and I don't know. I like it all, but row crop out here because it's a challenge. I mean, I grew up in Western Iowa, and there we didn't have any irrigation, didn't have any chemigation, didn't have a lot of the stuff we have to deal with out here, and the climate is so much different. So it's definitely a learning process. Every year is very different, and the old timers used to say, once you get west of the Missouri River, you measure water or rain in the hundredths of an inch. And yeah, that is very true. Hundredths of an inch. I'm used to, when I was growing up, it was always a tenth or two of rain, but now it's actual hundredths that we measure.
Well, you mentioned Western Iowa, and yeah, they used to think, or they still say they're still dry, but you're thinking that's an oasis compared to where you're at.
It is. They've actually gotten some snow, and I think at this point in time where we're at, we would take any moisture we can get at this point.
Well, Kyle, you mentioned in Nebraska, so the sand hills, right? Is there?
Correct.
But you're saying there's a little more sand west of you yet?
That is correct. The folks around here say the true sand hills start west of here, about 30, 40 miles. So yes, have some extended family over there, and they are right getting into the heart of the sand hills over in that country. And it's been very, very dry, very dry.
So you feed and finish, but you also work on analyzing and selling. Is that accurate?
That's correct, sir.
When you say analyze, what do you look at when it comes to cattle markets?
Most of the stuff I look at the cash market, obviously, because cash drives the futures market. I focus a lot on spreads. How are the front months behaving compared to the deferred contracts? And what are we seeing out there for movement? What's our slaughter pace? What's our feeder cattle movement? And where are we at on the calendar? That's always a good thing to know, too, is where we're at on the calendar. Also, like to watch the economic indicators, too, because, well, at the end of the day, beef is still demand driven, and while it's a good product, people still have to be able to afford to buy it.
We are recording this in late 2022. How has the year been for the cattle producer as a whole, not necessarily in Nebraska?
As a whole, it's like any other year. I'd say this year's been better, but it's had its ups and downs. This past week, we scored the highest cash market that we've seen all year. I'm actually kind of looking for a little bit firmer cash this week, but we are kind of at that cusp of the year, coming into the end of the year, where we could see this market break back a little bit based off the fact that we could see some slowing demand.
Is that a slow in demand because of just the time of year? You mentioned something about paying attention to the calendar, or is it because it's one of those too high prices knocked down the demand?
I think it's more of the time of the year. I mean, we're sitting here at the holidays. Most of the procurement for the box side is getting wrapped up for the end of the year. You're probably going to see a little bit more here after the holidays, maybe restock some of the shelves. And I think we'll see some intermittent demand once we get the snow cleared out of the Northeast. There'll be some boxes shipped to the Northeast. But for the most part, I think most of the consumers right now are looking at, well, I've got to put Christmas on. And, 30 days, we're going to be sitting here looking at a Christmas tree instead of each other, Paul. And then in 60 days, we're going to go to the mailbox and we're going to say, oh, yeah, about Christmas, that's starting to come due now. So I think there's that aspect that has to be taken into consideration.
Well, and the consumer is always both a good and fickle indicator, right? I mean, it's kind of hard to, I like to tell people, I was just speaking to a class recently, and I said, I've tried to go to the grocery store at the same time each Saturday since the COVID thing had started, just to kind of see my own scientific experiment of what has been up, what has been down, what's in the case, what's not in the case. I look at the the meat counter and I just see, am I crowded or am I not? And it's interesting to see how they shift. How has the consumer shifted the way you see things here in the last 2 years?
Well, I think they've shifted a lot more to the grocer instead of going out to restaurants. Obviously, since the nation and the world essentially was virtually locked down, we started to cook more at home. So I think the demand shifted more to home. They went to some nicer cuts while they were at home, but those higher dollar, high protein cuts are still a luxury item, and they still dollar up pretty fast at the cash register. So I do the same thing when we go to the city now. There was a time when the family and I lived out in the suburbs of Chicago, and it was always very interesting to me, a farm kid, where when we needed to go meat shopping, we just went to the freezer. I mean, let's face it, out here in some places, our protein bill comes off the Schedule F. So it was always very interesting to see how the consumer spent their dollar. And I think that since I guess I would say recently here, I've started to see them back off just a little bit, not a lot, but they've gone for some of the cheaper cuts. As we have some economic indicators that say we could be struggling economically.
Well, and is that the biggest sign of woe to come for the cattle producer when the consumer starts slowing up, or is there another factor that the cattle producer has to keep an eye on?
I think that's just part of the puzzle here, and I'm not sure which sector is going to get the margin squeezed the most, whether it's going to be the retailer or the packer or the feed yard or the actual feeder cattle producer. I haven't been able to pinpoint which one's going to get squeezed the hardest as far as margin goes, but I think as far as cattle production as a whole, we've seen some really good closeouts here lately from cattle that were bought here a year ago. Some of these cattle have been on feed for 290 to 300 plus days. They've had some really good returns. But when I look at it and the numbers that went into those cattle, we had a whole different cost structure going into it, whether it was our interest rates, cost of corn, cost of our feed, or just cost of feed in general, and cost of transportation. So now that we're placing cattle and we're looking at a summer futures out there trading at 155 to 160, depends on your month, I'm questioning, are we going to have the same margin? Is it going to be a little bit worse, or are we just handling more dollars in between? Did we have the same margin at 120 to 130 cattle that we're going to have at maybe 160 to 150 to 160, maybe 170 if we get there? Is the margin going to be the same? We're just handling more dollars in the middle. That's the question.
So different sets of dollars or different sources of them. Is that what I'm picking up what you're saying?
I guess what I'm looking at is different input costs.
Yeah.
Going to it. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So there's always a cost. It's just the cost is different. So you
That's
can
correct.
say, "Oh my goodness, this one's way higher," but look over here, it's way lower. So okay, I get what
Right.
you're saying. When you talk about margins, let's talk about the packer margin for a minute. I guess
Mhm.
I'll use you to say, what's your definition of a packer margin?
That's a good question. I don't know if there is a textbook. You could use add in your choice and select and divide it by a certain percentage and everything. But there's a lot of other factors that go into it. And so a rough estimate, yeah, you could say the Packers right now, maybe you're at break even, maybe making, $3 to $4 a hundred, whatever it may be. But what I look at here is where they're sitting at. And if this box continues to decline, and if we are on the precipice of tightening numbers out there, which some of the future spreads have indicated we could be tightening some of our numbers a little bit. I will give it that. We're still in bearish territory, getting on spreads. We can get to that later. But I would not be surprised if the packing industry doesn't come in here and try to break this market after the Thanksgiving holiday. And that seasonally, going back to the calendar again, that seasonally does happen once we get through this Thanksgiving holiday, where we see less demand because the boxes aren't moving. And then we do see an industry that does try to break the cash market just a little bit.
Well, I have to say that we hear a lot about the packer margin when it is in favor of the packer and not so much when it's in favor of the consumer. The politicians get a little excited because their constituents get excited. Is it good that when we have high packer margins?
It's tough to say. I think it's like any business. It's how you get everything bought on the input side, and I think that's how a producer needs to adjust on their end, is how they can protect themselves and control what they can control. I can't control what the packing industry makes, so it's something that I try not to focus on a lot because it doesn't help me in any way, shape, or form by the margin that they're making or not making. So what I try to focus on the producer side of things is what I can control going into my equation.
Well, and that's what I was going to say. So help me out. What can I control then right now?
I would say probably you could probably control the cost of feed inputs if we can do something like that, or we can probably we can do some things here as far as protecting our downside in this complex here. Like I said, everybody's margin is a little bit different. Some of these folks have a 160 that works in the summertime. Maybe it's in the form of an option or something along those lines, just to protect our downside. And that's something that we can control. We do have the control over what we can either lock in for a profit or lock in for a limited loss if that's the case. I don't know. Everybody's in a different situation, so it's best taken on a one-on-one basis.
And when you're talking there, are you helping others do this? Is that part of your business?
Yes, that is part of it. Yes.
So when you say, let's buy something here, let's protect it this way, let's look at that spread, how willing are customers to do that right now?
The folks that feed on margin or know that they have to lock in a certain amount of margin, if they're borrowing a lot of money, they are very willing to do it because they know where they're at the end of the day. Some of them that have a lot of equity or a lot of cash or don't have to worry about it so much, they're more willing to sit and ride for a little bit. But your yards that basically feed on margin, they are more apt on getting something protected, either whether it's corn to the upside or feeder cattle or live cattle to the downside. They're more apt on getting something protected and controlling that input or output cost.
When you look at cost structure, we kind of talked about how things are changing, have changed. Do you find that a larger producer is better to handle irregularities in input costs than a smaller producer?
Sometimes, but not necessarily. I know a lot of very successful smaller cattle feeding operations that they feed with some. There's some that feed with very new equipment, some that feed with very old equipment, and they have a very very good margin. And then I've seen some large yards that don't have very good margin either. So they are more trigger happy, if you will, to do something as far as protection, whether it's on the input side or on the protection side of the down in the cattle.
Well, we're talking about some generalities here about economy. What's the weather story going to do to this cattle market?
I think if we get some widespread rains out here, you'll see feeder cattle take off and rally really good because we'll start to see some heifer retention. Now, that's not going to be the first 1.5 or 2 inches of rain that falls out here on the plains. I think it's going to take a general soaking rain or multiple moisture events in order to get people back comfortable to be able to start retaining heifers, because we've depleted a lot of our grass, our stockpile grass, even our old hay piles and stuff like that we've been saving for reserves. A lot of those have been depleted, and a lot of the old cows have gone to town. So now we're kind of at a cusp here of, do we start to send younger cows to town, which it is somewhat happening in different areas. If they're coming off grass right now, especially in this area, and they don't have a calf on them or they're open, they're going to town.
So in a sense, I think I'm hearing you say there is been an upside to some of this reduction in herd, because maybe we have gotten rid of some of those animals that maybe weren't up to par with what we need to be efficient in our operation. Did I catch that?
Yeah, that is correct. That is correct. And most of your ranchers don't like to get rid of cows unless they're a fence jumper or they just don't produce. But it is just something that we have to live with from time to time. And that is correct. Should be taking out the poorer, lesser doing animals, and should be helping improve the efficiency. Now, whether that improves the efficiency of your pastures and whatnot, you may have to retain some there just to keep things in balance on that order.
Have you heard anything about some of the larger lots, or just anybody really for that matter, in Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, other big feeding areas, shipping animals temporarily somewhere else for feeding to kind of take off some of that pressure that might be in a drought location?
Sure, that was a big thing here last year. I do know of a few instances where they brought, especially your seed stock and purebred operations that have longevity and bloodlines, and it's not something they can just give up overnight and start back when next year if things turn back around. So there was some of that movement. There was some cattle moved from the southern plains up here last year to graze on stocks and some of the winter stockpile, and now we're at that point where some of our cattle might be getting shipped east over towards that Iowa direction there, where they do have corn stalks to graze and stuff like that for the wintertime.
How's that work that someone does? Do they just pick a random person? Is that a temporary thing that someone says, yeah, I'll feed for a cost? Structurally, how does that work?
Structurally, yeah, they basically take care of the cows for a certain amount of days for a certain amount per head per day, whatever it may be per operation. And then usually the person that owns the cattle there, they've got to pay the freight and whatnot. But then once they get there, they usually have to work out a deal with salt and mineral. Does who pays for what? Do we keep track of the receipts on that? But it's usually a per head per day or so many days per animal unit.
Now, are you hearing any region doing it more? I mean, granted, you're in the middle of Nebraska there, but I'd heard the story. We talked to the people in Oklahoma and said that was happening, or maybe not as many cattle were coming into Oklahoma because it had been dry. Is that what you're hearing?
There has been some of that. Yeah, there's been some move to the north here. I do know some that got moved to South Dakota from Oklahoma. Just kind of one of those deals too, where they kind of met up and it was the right fit for each other. Where one guy had the winter pasture he could spare, and the guy had some cattle that he needed to hold. So that's what I've seen. Yes.
All right, Kyle, let's do this. Live cattle. Let's talk futures. Looking for the next. I like to say 3 months. We're getting through the holiday. We'll get into the new year. Where are we headed?
I think once we get through the first quarter, we're going to be headed higher. I do think there's going to be a nice downturn here around the holidays, as there historically is. But I do think once we get through the first of the year, you do get some of that new year, new mentality, new money type thing coming back into the complex. And we've also seen some of our non-commercial traders liquidate their large long position here in the live cattle complex. So I would not be surprised if they come back. Now, that's all going to be depending on the economy and how they see it fit. Where are they going to best invest their dollars? Is that going to be back into the stock market? Is that going to be in the grains? Is that going to be into the live cattle? That remains to be seen yet. But we are starting to see some things change in this live cattle market. And by change, I mean looking out at those deferred live cattle spreads, as I mentioned before. We're still in bearish territory on those spreads. And bearish territory historically, I guess, is where we're still sitting with those, where the deferred contracts are still keeping the premium to the front. And I think that if we can get our feed cost under control here, you will see some guys feed cattle into that premium. Some of the operations are still of the mindset, big cattle, big check. So we could see some feed into that premium, yes. But I do think once we get through the first probably 4 or 5 months, maybe around that June, July timeframe, we could really start to see this tightening in numbers really start to affect the complex. And by that time, we should probably have most of the cows work through the system that we're going to have work through the system. And if it does start to rain, then I do see us lessening up that cow slaughter and then moving more into a live cattle slaughter.
Well, and do you think we've hit peak weights for now? I mean, that was a big story in the last 3 to 6 months, as weights were really high.
Yeah, we've seen a small decline here year over year, but I do think that weights are going to start trending higher. Now, we haven't seen that massive snowstorm in the southern plains that just keeps everything blocked up here for 2 weeks or whatever it is. But I do think that weights are going to seasonally start working higher, as they typically do this time of year.
Okay, let's look at the feeder cattle business. Same thing. What do you see here futures wise in the next 3 months?
Futures wise, that is one market that still has a little bit more bear spreading going on there. And by that, I mean they're keeping the premium out there in the back. Something that they really have going for them as far as the feeders go is the large short position held by the non-commercial traders out there. And I think that complex, like we saw today, saw a nice little rally to it, and it was a little bit vulnerable to some short covering, and I think that's what we're seeing. But what bothers me just a little bit here is this is the time of year where a lot of people get bulled up on the feeder cattle. And I'm actually taking more of a neutral to slightly bearish stance, because when I track that feeder cattle index versus where we're sitting at here with the January futures contract, we're sitting here in the mid 170s for a cash index. And we've got January trading, 182 area, 182 and a, or excuse me, 182, 182 and a half area. And those are going to have to converge at some point in time. And I don't think we're ready to do that just yet. And we're going to start to see lighter numbers come through here in the next 3 to 5 weeks as we get work through the holidays. And then it's typically a rough market or a softer market the first 2 weeks in January. But after that, we start to trend higher in feeders. And I really think that if we are coming short on these numbers, depending on what people have for input costs on the other side, whether, feed inputs and whatnot, we could start to see these feeders here once we get into late spring really take off, especially if we get some grass growing up here in the northern plains. You could see a lot of these folks with crick pastures and whatnot. They could really start to go to town and start buying these feeders to put on grass pastures.
Well, you get that inch. That's like 10 inches worth, right, of rain when you say you measure it in tenths of inch.
That's true, yes.
What about the hog industry or the poultry? Do you follow either of those?
I do follow the hogs a little bit and the poultry industry just a little bit as well too. But with the hogs, it's a lot more corporate. But I do follow the spreads there as well too. And after we've seen some nice rallies here in the hogs, it was good to get some protection on here a while back. But I do think that longer term, they're going to succumb and have some issues to deal with as far as live cattle do too, as far as economic woes and whatnot.
Do you see at least moving forward, well, I'll spread it out. I'll give you 6 months to 12 months. Do you see exports being a bigger deal in the hog market than it is the cattle market?
That's a very good question. I know a lot of eyes are on China right now as far as when it comes to pork, soybeans, grains, and things like that. But I don't see a lot of people talking about Mexico. And Mexico has seemingly been at the top of our export list several weeks in a row. When you see the pork shipments, sales and shipments, Mexico is number one. Mexico is number one. So I do think that exports are a big picture thing. I do think that if we can get this dollar to weaken a little bit, I think it's only going to help solidify our export picture, whether it's to Mexico or to China or other foreign countries, whether it's Pacific Rim as far as beef is concerned, or if it's to China as far as the pork is concerned. I think that's only going to help things if this dollar does break. And we've seen this dollar rallied up into the 113s, and now it's back into the 107. So I think that the dollar may have put in a long-term top. It's just going to take some time for us to get that dollar to settle back down and make us more competitive.
Poultry wise, we don't do much on the show with that, but I'm always curious what is going on. As we record this, it's right before Thanksgiving. We saw the we'll call it the Main Street press talks about the high price of turkey because of a lower population. We've been dealing with this HPAI. It looks like it might you never know how often that thing's going to cycle up and cause problems. But what's the ramifications on the other meat markets when poultry keeps having problems, specifically turkey?
Well, if you keep having or start to have more problems there with the avian industry, I think it's going to switch over to other meats, other white, like pork or beef. People are going to say, well, I want to eat meat, so that's what opportunity I have, or that's what choice I have. So if we do start to see thinner herds or numbers dial back there in the poultry, we could definitely see them switch proteins over. So we do have the cold storage report that's coming out on Tuesday, and that's one thing that I'm really going to be interested to see is where are we sitting at for broilers and turkeys, because it seems like those are the ones that are in high demand when meat is expensive. And I do know that a lot of people say that beef and pork per capita is just as competitive as pork or chicken. But when it comes to the cash register and you're laying out, cash to pay for groceries, they have been able to get more protein per se with turkey or chicken than it has been pork or beef. So I do know that per capita, it is about the cheapest out there and it's very competitive, but we always buy bigger cuts of beef or pork than we do turkey or chicken. So that's still in the consumer's back pocket there.
When I say the name Walt Hackney, what does that mean to you?
I remember watching Walt. He's a guy that he can put it all together with a one-liner, and I don't know if anybody will ever be able to compare to Walt Hackney, but he's the guy who had boots on the ground experience, whether it was in the sale barn or in the back sorting fat cattle. He had it there, and I really, really miss listening to Walt.
I cite a couple of his lines still to this day. It's hard to lose money taking a profit. A lot of people like to use that. But and he used to talk about greed. Kyle. Sometimes we get greed. He said in some of his operations, what they would do was put a number on each animal, and when that animal made that profit, they moved the animal down the line. Is that still apply to be a good philosophy?
I think it does. Yes, I really do. And there is that factor there, greed, and there's that difference. And I think he hits on it with that line too. There's the difference in greed and the difference in need. And if I need this and I've got it, then don't be greedy. Take it, move it on down the line, get rid of it. Let's get something else in here. And I do think that we've really worked on that here in the cattle industry as far as on the cash side, because with the way feed costs have gotten in the Southern Plains, I don't think producers have been greedy. I think that they've gotten where they could, they've gotten what they need, or they've gotten what they can get out of the animal, and so it's moved on down the line as opposed to trying to hold out for a little bit more.
Well, we're going to hold out for a little more conversation with you down the road, Kyle. I appreciate it a ton. Thank you so much.
You bet. Thank you.
All right, that's Kyle Bumsted. He's in Erickson, Nebraska. And thanks for joining us here on that cattle discussion. And thank you for watching here, this MTOM Show podcast. I'm Paul Yeager. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next Tuesday. New episodes come out. You can either subscribe in audio form or in video on YouTube. Thanks for watching.